I don't know if you saw this piece that Bernie Sanders wrote. This was last week, and I don't know how I missed it. This was on the 13th of July. But it starts out, the pharmaceutical industry has become a major health hazard to the American people. And he talks about how a researcher who was working at the Department of Veterans Affairs, funded with your tax dollars and mine, invented a drug, or developed a drug, or whatever the proper word is, that would kill the hepatitis C virus. Hepatitis C is a major problem. There are millions of people in the United States with it. We didn't even know it existed until, I think, probably the late 1980s, maybe the early 1990s. And so people, were told that they had, alcoholism or liver problems, but nobody knew what the cause was. Well, it turned out it was hepatitis C, this very kind of silent, slow-moving form of hepatitis. Hepatitis A and B are, pretty acute, quite visible. So anyhow, the drug, so this guy, he's working for the Department of Veterans Affairs, being paid for by you and me. Actually, let me just read this thing from Bernie. He talks about a new report out today from Americans for Tax Fairness, explains how a pharmaceutical company, Gilead Sciences, games the system to charge high prices, shift profits overseas, offshore, and avoid billions in U.S. taxes. Gilead sells a drug called Sovaldi, which is used to treat the hepatitis C virus, writes Bernie Sanders. The drug was developed with taxpayer funds by a researcher who worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs and founded a small drug company. Gilead bought that small drug company for $11 billion. I would add, making that researcher very wealthy. Presumably, acquired the government-provided monopoly rights, that would be the patent, and set the price at $1,000 a pill, or $84,000 per treatment in 2013. U.S. public and private insurers, taxpayers, and patients spent more on Sovaldi in 2014 than any other prescription drug. Gilead paid back its $11 billion investment in less than a year. And then he goes on to say patients with hepatitis C are often low income. A disproportionate number of them are veterans. I personally know people who believe that they got hep C back in the 60s in the military during the Vietnam War, when the military was experimenting with air guns to do vaccines. And they just lined 50 people up in a row and walked down the row going bang, 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 bang into people's shoulders and wiped the blood off each person because they didn't always work the way they were supposed to, and it often tore the skin. And thus, hep C spread. But, there are veterans who are alleging that the military is not owned up to it, to the best of my knowledge. But in any case, meanwhile, back to Bernie, Gilead's profits have quintupled since it started selling the drug, from $4 billion in 2013 to $22 billion last year. That's profits. That's what's left over after sales. That's what's left over after you pay the CEO his multi-million-dollar salary, et cetera, et cetera. And Bernie says it gets worse. The Americans for Tax Fairness reports find that Gilead has dodged nearly $10 billion in U.S. taxes. Now, keep in mind, we paid for for developing the drug that made them rich, and then they avoid paying taxes on over $10 billion in taxes on their profits. How? Well, Bernie writes, Gilead claimed that despite making two-thirds of its revenues here in the United States and charging higher drug prices than anywhere in the world, it only made about one-third of its profits in the United States, according to the report. The company pays an effective tax rate of just 1% in the foreign countries where it claims to do business. And in 2013, Gilead's chief financial officer said the formula for Sovaldi was being transferred to Ireland in order to lower the company's effective tax rate. The strategy worked. Gilead's worldwide effective tax rate dropped from 27% in 2013 to 16% in 2015. Bernie says many American corporations use this practice to avoid paying U.S. taxes, but Gilead's greed is particularly reprehensible because the American people paid for these drugs twice. First, taxpayers bankrolled the research behind the hepatitis C drugs, And then they paid a second time when Gilead decided to charge Americans the highest price in the world for treatment. And now Americans are getting cheated a third time as Gilead stashes its profits abroad to avoid taxes. And then he goes on to say, but, you know, this isn't all about one bad rogue company. No, this is standard operating procedure in the corporate world. Again, something you will not hear a word of at the Republican convention, because the Republican Party is the party of the 1%. They're the party of the billionaires and the corporations that made the billionaires billionaires. So anyhow, back to Bernie. He says, but Gilead is not the only company taking advantage of our public research funding and tax loopholes. Pfizer, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Eli Lilly, Bristol-Myers Squibb, and many others engage in similar offshore tax dodging to avoid billions in U.S. taxes every year. He points out that a billionaire like John C. Martin, who is up until this last March was the CEO of Gilead, year before last, 2014, he made almost $200 million as CEO. I think that there are 240 working days in a year, if I'm remembering correctly. Roughly 50 weeks, if you figure somebody takes 2 weeks of vacation. So there's 50 weeks in a year, 50 times 5 is 25, so that'd be 250 business days in a year, I guess. So this guy made $200 million for 250 days work. That's a little short of $1 million a day. Can you tell me what anybody could do that's worth $1 million a day? Well, actually, you can't tell me because you can't call in, because Comcast Business Services still hasn't shown up, and you know, Shano just tried to call him during the last break. And of course, it went right to sales, and sales immediately answered, yes, we'll be glad to take your money. No, I need service. Oh, service? Sorry, you're going to have to wait on hold. So to the best of my knowledge, Shano is still on hold waiting for service with Comcast Business, whatever they call it, Xfinity or something. I don't know what they're calling it. So anyway, back to Bernie. He says, at what point do we say that our tax system, our publicly funded research, and our patent system are not serving the public interest? At what point do we realize that they've been distorted to serve the private interests of a few billionaires like John C. Martin, Gilead's CEO until this past March, whose compensation peaked at almost $200 million in 2014? At what point will Congress have the courage to stand up to the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and say, enough is enough? Now, I don't think that Bernie is arguing that drug companies should be not-for-profits. I'm not arguing. Although I think, frankly, you could probably build a fairly strong case that any drug developed with, you know, U.S. research, which is the vast majority of these drugs that are making these companies rich, if we can't, at the very least, you know, tax their profits, we should be getting something back for that, you know. But no, they just want to basically screw us. He says, last year I asked the department, this is Bernie, I asked the Department of Veterans Affairs to use an existing law to allow the federal government to break patents in order to make hepatitis C drugs available to veterans. I also introduced a bill last year, the Corporate Tax Dodging Prevention Act, which would tax all profits of American corporations the same way, regardless of where they're earned. This would eliminate the incentive for companies to hide their profits overseas. I've supported legislation that would lower costs for consumers by rewarding developers of medicines on the basis of a drug's benefit to consumers. Under such a system, Sovaldi would have been awarded a substantial monetary prize, as it represented a major advancement for patients with Hep C. But under my proposal, the drug would immediately come on the market as a generic drug, saving consumers a decade or more of paying exorbitant prices for brand-name drugs. I also strongly support instructing Medicare to negotiate drug prices and reducing the barriers to the importation of prescription medication from Canada and other countries. So, very, very interesting.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.